In 1940, the world was burning at a rate no one had imagined. 27 nations at war, 60 million civilians displaced, entire coastlines swallowed by fear. And somewhere in the far South Pacific, on two quiet islands most generals could barely point to on a map, one impossible question echoed: how does a country with no tanks, no factories, and barely an army defend itself from a rising empire? Before that question exploded into New Zealand's national psyche, before the panic drills and the darkened cities, the story began with a single man, Bob Semple, a farm boy who spent his youth hauling timber, dragging dust across goldfields and learning the language of machines with the instinct of someone born to survive. Bob didn't grow up in the halls of privilege. He was raised in Taranaki, under skies split between ocean winds and the sweat of dairy fields. By age 15, he was repairing agricultural engines that baffled trained mechanics. By 20, he stood taller than most men around him, 6'3", shoulders carved from labor, hands that could lift steel sheets like firewood. But strength alone didn't define him. What defined him was conscience, raw, stubborn, and fed by belief. In the 1,890 seconds, when wages collapsed and farm workers were pushed to the edge, Bob organized laborers into unions. Landowners sent in forces to silence him. He kept speaking. Police tried to disperse meetings. He kept gathering people. When asked why he fought so hard, he answered simply, "Because someone has to." That answer would return decades later, when the world tilted toward chaos. By 1908, the uneducated farmhand became a member of parliament. By 1935, he rose to Minister of Public Works, a post that controlled roads, bridges, hydroelectric dams, and every machine capable of reshaping the young nation. He built concrete, steel, and faith. But none of his achievements could silence the statistics that haunted him. New Zealand, 1.6 million people, 10,000 kilometers from its nearest strong ally, 0 armored vehicles. Japan already controlling territories, holding more than 200 million people, expanding south with relentless momentum. And Europe collapsing piece by piece, leaving small nations exposed like driftwood in a rising tide. Bob studied the maps, the distances, the timing, the grim mathematics of isolation. He feared what newspapers refused to print. If danger came, help would be months away. If New Zealand fell, it would fall alone. So the farm boy who once welded broken tractor blades began asking himself a question that military strategists had not answered. What can we build with our own hands, with the tools we already have? This was the seed, the first spark in a long chain of decisions that would lead to one of the strangest machines in the history of warfare. A machine many would mock. A machine that would never fire a shot. A machine built not from steel but from desperation, ingenuity, and a nation's will to stand. And as the world marched toward 1941 and the Pacific darkened with the shadow of an empire, Bob Semple would soon discover that the storm he feared was closer and faster than anyone believed. In the first 18 months of World War II, the world's balance didn't just shift, it collapsed. 27 nations at war. Over 30,000 civilians lost every single week. Entire capitals reduced to rubble within hours. By mid-1940, Europe wasn't a continent, it was a cautionary tale written in smoke, and thousands of miles away, New Zealand felt the tremor long before the thunder reached its shores. The numbers were merciless. In June 1940, when France fell, more than 2 million Allied soldiers had either been captured or forced to retreat. In Asia, Japan's aggressive expansion had consumed territories containing over 200 million people. Their navy now dominated the Western Pacific with 10 aircraft carriers, more than any nation on Earth at the time, and dozens of cruisers sweeping south like the teeth of a storm. New Zealand, 2 islands, quiet and green, far from Europe's front lines, suddenly realized distance offered no safety. If an empire wanted to move south, the Pacific was its highway. Black and white footage of Wellington from 1940 often looks peaceful: streetcars rattling, children crossing intersections, but beneath that stillness lived a rising anxiety, because every newspaper headline screamed the same message. No one is coming to save you quickly enough. Britain, New Zealand's shield for generations, was fighting for its own survival. During the Blitz, London absorbed 57 consecutive nights of bombing, losing over 30,000 civilians in a single year. Their factories ran non-stop. Their convoys were sinking in the Atlantic at catastrophic rates. How could they spare tanks, guns, or aircraft for a country 10,000 kilometers away? Numbers don't panic. People do. And in 1940, New Zealanders began to see the Pacific through new eyes. Japan had already advanced through China, capturing city after city with terrifying speed. In 1940, they forced their way into French Indochina. In 1941, they occupied the rest of Southeast Asia. Each step tightened the arc southward toward the Dutch East Indies, toward Australia, and inevitably toward New Zealand. Military intelligence briefings used calm language, but the meaning was blunt. Japan could reach New Zealand's coastline in under 14 days. The situation at home, even worse. New Zealand's entire population at the time, 1.6 million people, fewer than many single cities in Asia. Its regular army, a few thousand troops, with most of the battle-ready forces already fighting in Greece and North Africa. Its tank force, 0. Its air force, tiny, scattered, nearly defenseless. There are photographs from 1941 showing Home Guard volunteers practicing with wooden rifles, literally broomsticks, painted black because the country didn't have enough real weapons to go around. Ammunition was rationed. Artillery was scarce. Anti-aircraft defenses were so limited that coastal towns relied mostly on blackout curtains and prayers. Parents dug backyard shelters. Schools practiced drills in case the Pacific situation changed overnight. Night after night, headlights were covered, street lamps were switched off. New Zealanders learned to move through a world of silhouettes, shadows, and silence. That was the atmosphere, tight, anxious, a nation listening for engines on the horizon when Bob Semple, now Minister of Public Works, stepped into the foreground of history. And while other officials debated theories, timelines, and diplomatic risks, Bob asked a simpler, harder question. What do we do if they land tomorrow? The War Cabinet didn't have an answer. The Defense Ministry didn't have an answer. The generals didn't have an answer. Because the truth was raw and unmistakable, New Zealand did not have the tools to defend itself. Countries with massive industries could wait for perfect machines. New Zealand could not. A 12-day invasion window leaves no space for idealism. Bob Semple, the same man who once welded broken blades and lifted steel beams with his bare hands, realized something that others were afraid to say out loud. We either build what we can, or we wait helplessly. This wasn't bravado. It was arithmetic. Britain could not send tanks. The United States was not yet in the war. Shipping lanes were dangerous. Factories were full. Time was gone. The black and white world of 1940 was not one of heroic last stands or speeches. It was a world of improvisation, of grabbing whatever tools you could find, of making something out of almost nothing. And it was in that pressure chamber, under fear, under scarcity, under the weight of global collapse, that an idea began to take shape inside Bob Semple's mind. An idea so unconventional that it would be mocked for decades. An idea born not from engineering textbooks, but from farmyards, construction sites, and diesel-stained workshops. An idea that would roll forward on steel tracks and corrugated plates. And in Chapter 3, that idea will take shape, bolted together by welders, fed by belief, and driven by a nation refusing to be helpless. War has a way of crushing the distance between the impossible and the necessary. By early 1941, as the Pacific tightened like a steel vice, New Zealand faced a set of numbers no nation should ever see. 0 tanks, 0 armored cars, 0 heavy factories capable of building either. And against them, an empire with over 5,000 warplanes, millions of soldiers, and a navy sweeping the ocean with industrial precision. Every statistic was a hammer. Every map was a warning. Every intelligence report pushed the country closer to the edge. And yet, in the middle of that pressure, Bob Semple saw something others missed. Resources hiding in plain sight. New Zealand didn't have tank factories, but it had tractors, hundreds of them. Powerful, stubborn machines built to haul timber, drag earth, and survive the unforgiving fields of the South Pacific. Machines that didn't fear mud, didn't break easily, and didn't complain. And Bob, the farm boy turned minister, understood tractors like generals understood battlefields. The spark arrived one afternoon in Canterbury. Semple stood near a construction site, watching a Caterpillar D8 tear through soil, dragging dust behind its tracks like a beast waking from sleep. A 110-horsepower engine roared under its hood, primitive compared to tanks overseas, but reliable, steady, and already in New Zealand by the dozens. He asked a question that startled the workers around him. What if we armored that? Logic said it was ridiculous. Caution said it was risky. Necessity said it was the only idea anyone had. Within days, the thought hardened into action. Semple assembled a team: engineers, welders, mechanics, men who knew steel by touch, not textbooks. They were not military designers. They were workshop fighters, living on tea, night shifts, and the urgency of a country running out of time. The site, the Wellington Railway Workshops, one of the few places in the nation with enough machinery to shape steel at scale. The directive: build a functional armored vehicle in weeks, not months. The materials: corrugated iron sheets, the same used on barns and sheds, from Taranaki to Otago. Heavy framing steel from public works depots. Bren, 303 machine guns. New Zealand had a few dozen in reserve. And the backbone, the Caterpillar D8. This wasn't engineering. This was improvisation under fire. Workers welded through the night. Sparks flew against the workshop walls like shattered stars. The smell of hot metal soaked into the rafters. The tempo of hammers, drills, and cutting torches became a war rhythm of its own. New Zealand's first attempt to build a war machine from scratch. The design grew stranger by the hour. The armor box rose higher and higher to fit 8 men inside: driver, commander, and gunners stationed around the hull. With every steel plate added, the machine looked less like a tractor and more like a rolling bunker or a farm shed that decided to fight back. When the first prototype emerged in late 1940, workers stepped back, unsure whether to cheer or laugh. At over 3.5 meters tall, it towered above every real tank in the world. At 15 kilometers per hour, it crawled slow, stubborn, loud. The armor, just 12-13 millimeters, could stop light fire, but nothing heavier. The cabin, poorly ventilated, could reach over 50 degrees Celsius during tests. But it moved, it fired, and for the first time in history, New Zealand had something that could be called a tank. The press arrived for the first public demonstration. Cameras clicked, Bren guns rattled. The machine lumbered across a rail yard like a prehistoric steel creature fed by belief instead of fuel. Some newspapers applauded the courage. Others mocked it instantly. Semple's iron shed, the corrugated monster, New Zealand's rolling joke. But ridicule didn't matter. The strategic logic was brutal and simple. A bad tank was still better than no tank. Japan had already taken over territories containing 70% of the region's rubber supply, 60% of its tin, and nearly the entire coastline between Hong Kong and Singapore. The Pacific was not a rumor, it was a countdown. New Zealand didn't have months left. At times, it felt like they barely had weeks. So Semple gave the order: build more, build them now. Production ramped up. Crews worked in shifts around the clock. Welding torches burned through foggy Wellington nights. A small nation was trying, with everything it had, to prepare for a storm bigger than itself. And as more of the strange machines rolled out loud, tall, awkward, they carried something far heavier than steel, the hopes of people who refused to surrender to fear. But the world was changing faster than New Zealand's workshops could keep up. Beyond the Pacific horizon, a strike was coming, one that would drag the United States into the war, unleash a new tide of power in the region, and render Semple's improvised army suddenly obsolete. History doesn't always move slowly. Sometimes it snaps sudden, violent, irreversible, and every plan, every fear, every desperate improvisation is instantly rewritten. For New Zealand, that snap came on the 7th of December, 1941. Japan's strike on Pearl Harbor destroyed or damaged 19 American naval vessels, 188 aircraft, and pushed the United States, an industrial giant, producing half of the world's manufactured goods, into the war overnight. Within hours, the Pacific map rewrote itself. Within days, Japanese forces surged across the region with astonishing speed, capturing Hong Kong, overrunning the Philippines, sweeping through British Malaya, threatening Australia and New Guinea, and controlling sea lanes that stretched across millions of square miles. By February 1942, Singapore, a fortress thought to be impregnable, fell in just 7 weeks, and with its collapse came 130,000 British and Commonwealth troops captured in a single blow. It was the largest surrender in British military history. Every statistic hit New Zealand like a hammer. Every headline deepened the dread. But something else arrived, something that changed everything. The United States Navy and Marine Corps. American ships began pouring into the South Pacific. Aircraft carriers, cruisers, destroyers, fleets, so large they turned harbors into forests of masts and steel. American engineers built runways from nothing, laying concrete across the Pacific like stepping stones. And with those troops came equipment New Zealand had never seen in person before. Sherman tanks, Stuarts, armored cars, anti-aircraft guns, fighter squadrons, machines built not in sheds or rail workshops, but in Detroit's massive factories, where assembly lines stretched like steel rivers and could produce a new tank every 30 minutes. Compared to these, the Bob Semple tank, New Zealand's corrugated iron underdog, looked like a relic from another century. The shift was immediate and undeniable. New Zealand was no longer isolated, no longer waiting in the dark, no longer alone. American presence didn't erase the threat, but it changed the equation. With US fleets shielding the ocean and Allied aircraft defending the skies, the once urgent fear of an invasion began to fade into something else: cautious relief. And with that relief came a brutal, unavoidable truth. The Semple tanks were no longer necessary. Production slowed. Workshops were reassigned to tasks that mattered more: repairing Allied vehicles, building roads, constructing airfields. Caterpillar tractors, desperately needed for engineering, were pulled out of the half-built hulls and sent back to construction duty. A project born from fear was now being undone by hope. Still, the tank wasn't dismissed with anger, not by those who had trained with it, not by those who had welded every uneven seam. Home Guard volunteers remembered what it felt like in 1940, when the Pacific loomed like a dark wave, when every rumor tightened the air, when families whispered at dinner tables about what might happen next. For them, the Semple tank wasn't a failure. It was proof concrete, loud, steel-tracked proof that the nation was not defenseless, that someone was trying, that when the world pressed in, New Zealand pushed back. But politics is never sentimental. In Parliament, opposition members mocked the tanks, calling them monuments to panic or rolling sheds with delusions of grandeur. Bob Semple, weathered and unyielding, took the criticism without retreat. He never claimed the machines were perfect. He claimed they were available when nothing else was. By mid-1942, the program was officially cancelled. No Semple tank ever fired in combat. None made it to the front. Most were scrapped quietly, their iron repurposed for real military needs. Others were dismantled and forgotten, absorbed back into the peacetime machinery of a small nation trying to regain its breath. But even as the tanks disappeared, something unexpected remained. The story, the defiance, the audacity. It lingered in workshops. It lingered in the memories of railway men who welded through the night. It lingered in the hearts of rural volunteers who stood guard with broomstick rifles and said, "At least we have something now." And that lingering ember, small, bright, stubborn, would eventually ignite again decades later, long after the war ended. Because history has a strange way of resurrecting the things it once mocked. History is ruthless with its judgments, until time softens the edges and lets us see the truth beneath the rust. For decades, the Bob Semple tank lay forgotten, dismantled, scrapped, dragged back into the quiet anonymity from which it was born. But ideas, especially those sparked by fear, welded by hope, and fed by belief, rarely disappear. They settle, they wait, and then, unexpectedly, they rise. And rise it did. When the war ended in 1945, the world counted its losses. More than 75 million lives, entire cities erased, a global economy shattered. New Zealand, though spared the worst, carried its own scars, thousands of soldiers lost overseas, families grieving across 2 islands, industries stretched thin by 6 years of relentless pressure. In the black and white aftermath of a world rebuilt from ashes, the Semple tank seemed like a strange footnote, an awkward reminder of panic years most people wanted to forget. But not Bob Semple. In his final interviews, he spoke with the same calm stubbornness that carried him through the crisis. We acted because doing nothing would have been worse. He didn't claim brilliance, he claimed responsibility. And responsibility, history eventually realized, is its own form of courage. As the decades passed, the world changed. New Zealand grew, connected, modernized. The memory of 1940's fear faded into textbooks. But then, the internet happened. The tank that once crawled across a Wellington rail yard at 15 kilometers per hour suddenly roared back to life, digitally shared, debated, memed by millions. People were fascinated by this corrugated iron giant, this rolling symbol of desperation and determination. A tank that never fought, but somehow won. War Thunder players demanded it as a collectible. Hearts of Iron 4 modders coded it as a secret tech path. Forums filled with jokes, sketches, admiration, mockery, affection, an entire cultural movement orbiting around a machine most nations would have buried in silence. The world had grown cynical, polished, obsessed with perfection. And here came a tank that was proudly, almost heroically imperfect. It resonated, because everyone has had a moment when the ideal tool was out of reach. Everyone has improvised with whatever they had: duct tape, hope, and stubbornness. Everyone has faced a crisis where perfection wasn't an option, only action was. Suddenly, the Semple tank wasn't an artifact. It was a metaphor. A professor in Wellington put it simply: the Semple tank is the human spirit, corrugated, uneven, and still moving forward. That message reached builders, gamers, historians, and ordinary people alike. And then something remarkable happened. In 2018, a group of enthusiasts in Christchurch decided to resurrect it physically, not digitally, not ironically, but as a full-scale, running replica. They hunted down a Caterpillar D8 chassis from the 1942, hauling it out of a shed like a fossil dug from time. They recreated the corrugated armor, one sheet at a time. They shaped the hull using archival photos, faded blueprints, and the memories of workers whose fathers welded the original. When the replica finally rolled out in 2021, its diesel engine rumbling, its plates shaking, it wasn't a joke. It was a tribute. Crowds gathered, cameras lifted. The tank dragged dust across the same kind of earth from which its idea was born. And people cheered not because it was powerful, but because it existed at all. A failure reclaimed as inspiration. Because now, with time and distance, the logic was clear. New Zealand in 1940 didn't need the best machine. It needed a symbol. It needed proof of motion when everything else stood still. It needed a reminder that hope doesn't wait for ideal conditions, it improvises. And that is why the story endures. Not as a tale of engineering brilliance, not as a military achievement, but as a testament to what small nations, small workshops, and small groups of determined people can do when pushed against the wall. The farmer politician who once welded broken blades became the man who welded a country's morale. The tank built from fear, became a monument to resilience. And the world, after laughing at it, ended up embracing it because deep down, everyone understood. Trying and failing is still courage. Doing nothing is not. In the black and white flicker of history, the Semple Tank stands tall, not because it was strong, but because it carried the weight of a nation that refused to surrender. And that is why, more than 80 years later, its engine still echoes, not through battlefields, but through every person who has ever faced the impossible and said, "We build with what we have."